After being announced back in 2012 and experiencing what could only be called a troubled development cycle, I'm not sure Cyberpunk 2077 could have ever lived up to the hype that it amassed behind it. But even as someone with pretty measured expectations, I can't help but find myself disappointed by CD Projekt Red's latest release. Though the game features a world and story that hooked me well enough to push through to the credits, it serves as a vehicle for bland combat and lackluster RPG elements, and this is without talking about the legion of bugs marring the already so-so experience. But hey, since it's probably the most noteworthy element of Cyberpunk 2077, let's talk about the absolute state of this game upon release. For full transparency, my 40 hours of game time was spent on the PS4 version of the game, played via backwards compatibility on the PS5, so this isn't even the worst possible version of Cyberpunk 2077 out there. With that in mind, I still ran into more than my fair share of technical shortcomings, including more crashes than I cared to count, functions that simply stopped working, such as the toggle camera option while driving or the skip dialogue button in dialogue, and less frustrating but no less immersion-breaking glitches like having cars fall from the sky or my character's hair and clothing disappearing during cutscenes. It's not all bad, as Cyberpunk 2077 does manage to maintain a fairly solid 60 frames per second during play, outside of regular dips while driving, but a mostly smooth frame rate doesn't really make up for the rest of the game's technical issues. Now that we have that out of the way, it's worth noting that even beyond graphical glitches and rampant crashes, the version of Cyberpunk that I played was a bit of a mixed bag in terms of its visuals. Night City, the futuristic dystopia that the game lets you loose in, is a surprisingly varied setting to explore, with towering corporate structures and neon-soaked back alleys, just a short drive from entire rundown districts and stretches of sandy desert. However, despite the surprising amount of variety within the setting, Cyberpunk 2077 can't help but look a little flat, on consoles at least. The game doesn't look bad, unless you're running it on a base last-gen console, of course. It just lacks a layer of polish to really help it stand out. I think the game's audio components fare a little bit better, but they aren't without their own issues. Of particular note are the original tracks recorded by Swedish band Refused, which serve as the back catalogue of the in-universe band Samurai, but the rest of the game's soundtrack sort of blurred together for me. It utilizes a lot of synth and metal elements to create a dark, harsh atmosphere which works wonderfully for the game's tone, but I'd be lying if I said that any individual track stood out. Cyberpunk 2077's voice work, meanwhile, is fairly solid across the board and features the kind of diversity in accents and languages that you would expect from a futuristic cultural melting pot like Night City, though I did find it a bit strange that every Japanese character I ran into had a super thick accent as though they had literally just moved into town yesterday. The game's most notable inclusion has to be Keanu Reeves as Johnny Silverhand, an established character in the tabletop role-playing game, but I wouldn't call this a particularly impressive performance by any means. It's just Keanu Reeves being Keanu Reeves, an overly crass, edgy for the sake of being edgy Keanu Reeves, sure, but Keanu Reeves nonetheless. Which brings us to Cyberpunk 2077's writing, which feels a little off on more than one occasion. Disregarding the game's often cringeworthy use of vulgarity, much of the dialogue feels as though it's been poorly localized into English, with characters avoiding using contractions or just using weird turns of phrase, beyond the fictitious future slang that I actually found worked pretty well in general. It's frustrating because the off-kilter writing often distracted me from the plot itself, which is genuinely gripping for the most part. Set in the year 2077, Cyberpunk casts players as V, a mercenary looking to build their legend in Night City, a sprawling metropolis where ruthless megacorporations and dangerous street gangs are waging a constant war for dominance. Following a job gone horribly wrong, V finds themselves in possession of an experimental piece of tech which is slowly killing them, while also threatening to overwrite their personality with that of the long-deceased rocker boy, Johnny Silverhand, who V can now see and communicate with. The GTA-style quest for status that the story begins as is pretty generic, and nothing about the game feels particularly cyberpunk with a lowercase c, until your character's goals shift from thriving in Night City to surviving it, which is a fair few hours in. Once that shift happened, however, I was absolutely hooked. The history concerning Johnny Silverhand and the city's megacorps is really interesting, and the details regarding how he wound up in your character's head, as well as how to safely remove him, had me excited to see how the narrative would unfold. Cyberpunk 2077 supplements this ticking clock-style narrative with a cavalcade of side quests which are home to some of the more engaging stories of Night City at the cost of defanging the implied time constraints of the main plot. It's really hard to be worried about your slow and steady death when you've just spent 15 hours helping out your new buddies, you know? On top of lowering the main story's stakes a little bit, a lot of these side quests involve helping cops or Night City's corporate overlords, leaving the game feeling a little lacking on the punk front outside of Johnny Silverhand's anarchist ramblings. There are some side stories that lean a little more anti-authoritarian, but after 40 hours of gameplay, it felt like these weren't nearly as prevalent as the game's name would imply. What I did find to be prevalent after 40 hours of gameplay, aside from rampant bugs and performance issues, was a lack of truly compelling gameplay. While Cyberpunk 2077 offers first-person shooting and melee combat, RPG elements, light driving, and stealth mechanics, I found most of it to be fine at best and not particularly enjoyable at worst. Since it spawned from a tabletop RPG, we should probably begin by talking about Cyberpunk 2077's RPG elements, which allow you to tailor your V towards a specific style of play. You have 5 attributes to invest points into. Body, which dictates your raw physical power and effectiveness with heavier weapons. Reflexes, which determines your movement speed and skill with lighter weapons. Technical ability, which lets you handle tech weapons and operate certain devices. Intelligence, which dictates your hacking ability. And Cool, which determines your resilience, composure, and proficiency with stealth. In my experience, the most important thing that these attributes affect is your ability to choose certain dialogue options or access different paths through areas. For instance, I built a character with plenty of points in body, so I was intimidating my way through conversations or tearing locked doors open wherever I could. Unfortunately, the meaningful differences between character builds and how they progress through missions feels rather limited. Typically, it feels like having the required skills to meet certain locked paths or dialogue options boils down to avoiding or not avoiding a fight, or getting paid a little more or a little less. That isn't to say that your choices never have an impact on the trajectory of a given story arc, but I often felt like my influence and freedom to really roleplay was minimal at best. Beyond giving you some more options in terms of exploration or dialogue, your attributes each have a handful of perk trees attached to them as well. Unfortunately, a lot of the perks in Cyberpunk 2077 boil down to percentile increases in different aspects of play. You can get more damage with certain weapons, faster movement or quicker stamina regeneration, and although I've not played with more than one build, it really does feel like most perks simply make your numbers go up, which is kind of boring. Not every perk acts that way though. Technical ability perks increase your grenade damage, sure, but they also let you loot better crafting components from enemies or allow you to craft better gear. The problem with that is that crafting systems are boring, and Cyberpunk's is no different. You also come across a steady stream of more powerful weapons and better clothing as you progress through the game, so this system ultimately feels pretty useless. The intelligence perks based around the game's version of hacking are much more useful in comparison, allowing you to unlock new hacks while improving the effectiveness of your existing hacks. Now, I didn't experience many of these expanded hacking abilities for myself, as I made a big strong dum-dum who hits people with a hammer, but it's not like the basic hacking abilities that you start with tempted me to dive any deeper down that rabbit hole. To sum the hacking mechanics up, you basically scan the environment with your optic implants and highlight hackable devices and enemies. The game gives you a list of options, each with their own bandwidth cost, and enacting one of these hacks is a simple matter of clicking on it and waiting for it to take effect. It's a very streamlined approach to hacking, lacking any minigames beyond the number-matching breach hack that lowers the cost of your other hacks, but while it works well enough, it just didn't make me want to engage with it. Similarly, Cyberpunk 2077's combat mechanics are functional but not overly enjoyable. The game features a decent selection of guns, including pistols, assault rifles, shotguns, and light machine guns, as well as a small variety of blunt and bladed melee weapons, with each weapon type benefiting from either body or reflex-heavy characters. Though each weapon does manage to feel substantially different from the others, I found it really hard to get excited about running into combat. Guns feel like they should be pretty powerful, but most enemies beyond the early hours just soak up damage like crazy. Instead of making combat difficult, however, it just turns encounters into a time sink, as enemy AI rarely does so much as take cover, and you will almost always have a few dozen healing items on you at any given time. Meanwhile, melee combat is slow and clunky when it's working, and annoyingly unresponsive when it isn't, as the game would often fail to register attempted blocks or hits in rapid succession at all. Now, you could simply sneak your way through the majority of the game's encounters, but Cyberpunk's stealth mechanics also leave a little something to be desired. While most enemies will take a little time to turn hostile after catching a glimpse of you, I experienced numerous occasions where entire gangs would become hostile with little to no provocation on my part. And even if only one enemy spots you, you can bet that everyone in the vicinity will be gunning for you immediately. You are able to silently take down unaware guards or use your hacks to blind them or security cameras, so it's not like you don't have some tools at your disposal, but at the end of the day, I just found Cyberpunk 2077's stealth features to be far too rigid and unforgiving to be fun. Conversely, the game's driving mechanics are just loose enough to make speeding around Night City's streets surprisingly satisfying. Granted, there isn't a huge amount to do in cars, with racing side missions making up a tiny fraction of the overall content of the game, but I can gladly say that they were also the part of the game that I found myself enjoying the most. It is a shame that the majority of the game's crashing seem to occur while driving, and as mentioned before, the frame rate is at its most unstable when you're in a fast-moving vehicle, but I'll take my fun where I can get it at this stage. I will say it would have been more fun to augment the hell out of my character with the game's variety of cybernetics, but bafflingly, Cyberpunk 2077 has made the majority of its interesting body modifications, such as the legs that allow you to double jump or the gorilla arms that let you tear turrets out of the ground and use them as normal guns, ludicrously expensive. This wouldn't be much of an issue, but it feels like the majority of the game's quests don't pay very well either. As a result, I spent most of the game saving to buy my desired upgrades rather than actually using them, though admittedly, once I did get them, tearing turrets out of the ground and laying into crowds of enemies is about the most fun I had outside of a car. Finally, the most unique element of Cyberpunk 2077's gameplay is the brain dance mechanic, wherein you relive other people's memories with the ability to pause and rewind them while you scan the scene for information. The problem here is that they're not actually all that unique, aside from their now altered, seizure-triggering opening sequence, as they featured heavily back in Batman Arkham Knight, and they're no more fun or engaging than they were in that game. These brain dances are glorified interactive cutscenes, and I'm not sure that interactivity really adds all that much to the experience. Now, if for some reason the gameplay I've talked about sounds interesting to you, then good news. Cyberpunk 2077 has a pretty sizable amount of content to back it all up, though it's hard to call it all meaningful. In my 40 hours of play, I completed all of the main jobs and side jobs that I naturally found without a guide, but the map is also littered with filler content that you'll likely burn out on long before making a dent in it. Also, the game seems to think that buying cars is a valuable mission worth tracking, so if you're adamant about clearing everything out of your mission log, look forward to wasting a ton of time and money on that. More importantly though, there's always the prospect of repeat playthroughs where you can experience different backgrounds, dialogue options, and character builds. Personally though, I've had more than enough of this game for one lifetime in a single playthrough, but your mileage will obviously vary. And with all that said, Cyberpunk 2077 is bad. Were it simply a compelling story with some weird writing wrapped around a bunch of mediocre gameplay elements, I would say that Cyberpunk 2077 was an okay game. Maybe not good, definitely not great, but okay. However, its state at time of release, as well as the fact that so many issues remain after multiple sizable patches, is unacceptable, and makes the unsatisfying gameplay that much less tolerable. Will further patches make the game better? I would fucking hope so, but I can only review what I have in front of me, can't I? The only people I could reasonably recommend this game to are die-hard fans of the tabletop role-playing game, but even then, I think you'd be better off just starting a new campaign of that. Cyberpunk 2077 is available for PC, and while it is technically also available on Xbox One and PS4, you should avoid those versions like the plague.